Zilphara stood in front of the human speed dating event, towering over the other attendees, like a walking skyscraper. She had to crouch to fit through the door, but still managed to knock over a few chairs as she made her way inside. The awkward, uncomfortable stares from the humans were enough to make her want to shrink into a corner. But no, she wasn't about to give up. This was her last chance. She had tried everything else to find love, the normal, dating apps, the alien planet matchmaking services that never worked, even dating outside her species, and it all ended in failure. After a few more bumps and awkward glances, she finally sat down. The table creaked under her massive weight. Her shoulders brushed the ceiling, and she awkwardly shifted to the side so her arm wouldn't take out the nearby drinks. She could feel the eyes on her, some of them filled with fear, others with curiosity, but none of them with anything that looked like genuine interest. Her date arrived, Jake, a young human who immediately took a wide step back after getting a good look at her. She smiled awkwardly, but he didn't seem to be impressed. Instead, he sat at the far edge of the table, arms crossed, and eyed her nervously. "So, Zilphara," Jake said, forcing out the name with difficulty. "What's it like being so big?" She tried to keep the conversation light. "Well, it's certainly not as easy as it looks," she said, giving a tight-lipped smile. "I can't sit in most human chairs without breaking them, and human furniture? Forget it." He managed a weak laugh, but the tension didn't break. She could tell he wasn't into her, not that she expected him to be. She'd been rejected too many times already to get her hopes up. They made small talk, but every time she moved, something went wrong. Her elbow knocked over the drink he had barely touched, spilling it all over the table. She winced. "I'm so sorry." He wiped his hands on a napkin and looked at her like she was some kind of natural disaster. "No problem, I guess," he mumbled. But the discomfort was too thick to ignore. He was clearly counting down the minutes to escape, and she couldn't blame him. She had just stood up to leave when she bumped her head against the ceiling. She grunted in pain, but no one offered to help. She stumbled backward and knocked over another chair. "Great. Another failure," she muttered to herself, rubbing the bruise on her forehead. She glanced around the room, but no one met her gaze. At that moment, she realized something. Every time she came out here trying to connect, she felt like a freak, a monster. Maybe she was too big for human love. Maybe there was no place for someone like her. But before she could gather the strength to leave, she heard a voice from behind. "I'm sorry, but I think I can help." She turned to see a human, one she hadn't noticed before, standing near the door with a confident grin on his face. He was shorter than most humans, a bit scruffy, but there was something in his posture that made him look unbothered by her size. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Dating Expert," with a big red heart on it. Sorry, who are you?" Zilphara asked, confused. "Name's Ted," the human said. "I've heard about you, Zilphara. Big fan of your uniqueness." His grin widened as he stepped toward her. She blinked. "Fan? What do you mean?" "Well, I'm sort of a romantic coach, you could say." Ted scratched the back of his head awkwardly. "I help people get over their relationship issues. You've been having a hard time, right?" Zilphara narrowed her eyes. "How did you know about me?" "I do a bit of research on the side." He gave her a knowing look, his eyes twinkling with humor. "And from what I gather, you're having some trouble with your size? Finding someone to date, I mean." She blinked again. Was this guy for real? "Listen, I've got a bit of experience in this area," Ted continued, stepping closer and lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Maybe I could teach you a few things. You know, how to navigate human romance." She stared at him in disbelief. "How would you know anything about it?" Ted chuckled. Let's just say I've been through enough bad dates to know what not to do. Zilphra could feel her skepticism rising, but something about him intrigued her. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't seem freaked out by her height, or maybe it was the way he was speaking to her like she wasn't some strange alien out of place in the human world. Either way, she decided to bite. Fine. Teach me, then, she said, her tone a mix of challenge and hope. Ted grinned. All right, first rule, you've got to be relaxed. No more of that stiff, awkward energy. Relaxed is attractive. Zilphra let out a deep sigh and settled back into her chair. She had no idea how this was supposed to work, but she had to try something. Maybe Ted was the answer. At least he was offering something different from the usual rejection. She watched him as he leaned in to demonstrate a casual flirt move, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms, and making eye contact. But when she tried to mimic his pose, the chair beneath her creaked loudly and nearly collapsed. She caught herself, nearly knocking over the table in the process. Ted blinked and held up his hands in mock surrender. Maybe not that relaxed. Zilphra let out an awkward laugh. I'm sorry. It's just my size. It makes everything difficult. Ted nodded knowingly. Yeah, I get that. But don't let it mess with your confidence. Trust me, humans love confidence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small mirror. Here, look at yourself. You've got this. She stared at her reflection, unsure whether to feel self-conscious or proud. She didn't look monstrous. She looked, well, different, but there was a certain elegance to her. She wasn't some hulking alien. She was a beautiful, powerful woman who could command attention with every step. For the first time that evening, she felt a spark of hope. Okay, she said, setting the mirror down and looking Ted in the eye. I think I can do this. Teach me more. Ted grinned and stood up, clapping his hands. All right, let's get started. First lesson, eye contact. The secret to human attraction is in the eyes. Watch me. He locked eyes with her. See? Confidence. Now you try. Zilphra did as instructed. She tried to focus on Ted, not letting her gaze waver. She saw the tiny gleam of approval in his eyes. Maybe this wouldn't be so impossible after all. Ted raised an eyebrow. You're a natural. Now let's move on to the next part, touching. Zilphra felt a flutter in her chest. This was going to get interesting. Zilphra had always believed that human touch was nothing but awkward and fleeting. She had seen it in the movies, the way humans would shake hands, pat each other on the back, or awkwardly tap someone's shoulder in a show of support. But Ted's approach was something entirely different. He was confident, direct, and seemingly unbothered by the fact that she could crush him if she wasn't careful. All right, Ted said, standing up and moving toward her. Touching is all about comfort, ease, and being respectful of personal space. But considering, well, your space issues, he chuckled, we'll have to improvise. Zilphra nodded, trying not to wince at the thought of accidentally squashing him. Ted was smaller than most humans, but still, his size seemed so insignificant compared to hers. She had always been aware of her size, the way it made people recoil, but Ted was treating her like, well, like a normal person. First things first, Ted said, holding out his hand. A simple handshake. Zilphra blinked in confusion. She had never done this before. A handshake? She asked, looking at his tiny hand, so fragile in comparison to hers. Yeah, a handshake. It's easy. Firm grip, not too tight, just a friendly exchange of energy. Like this. Ted grabbed her hand and gave it a brief, firm shake. His hand disappeared into hers as she carefully reciprocated, not wanting to crush him in the process. She felt his fingers pressing against hers, but it was strangely comforting. It wasn't awkward at all. Well, at least not for her. Ted looked up at her with a smile. See? Simple. Zilphira let out a soft laugh, the first real laugh of the evening. That wasn't so bad. Good. You're getting the hang of it, Ted said, stepping back and crossing his arms. Next up, the touching without touching. We'll call it the art of the near touch. Zilphira raised an eyebrow, confused. The art of near touch? Yep, exactly, Ted explained. Sometimes humans don't want to get too close, but still want to feel the connection. It's all about being just close enough, so close you almost feel the touch, but not quite. He moved closer to her, hovering just within her reach. Like this, he said, teasing her with a playful wink. You don't need to touch, but just being near can send the right message. Zilphira tried to mirror his movements, stepping just a little bit closer to him without actually touching him. It was strange, intimate, even, but there was something undeniably comfortable about it. She noticed how his gaze softened as he stood there, almost like the space between them became charged with something unspoken. Okay, that's weird, but I get it, Zilphira said, her voice laced with amusement. You'll get used to it, Ted assured her with a grin. But here's where things get fun, touching without saying a word. Zilphira tilted her head. What do you mean? Body language, he said. It's one of the most powerful ways humans communicate. You don't need to talk, just feel the connection. He demonstrated, putting a hand on his heart and giving her a meaningful look. See, without saying anything, I'm showing I'm open. Now you try. Zilphira hesitated, not used to this kind of vulnerability. But she decided to give it a go. She placed her hand on her chest and gave Ted a gentle look. It felt strange, but good somehow. She could feel the tension in her body ease as she connected with him in a way that didn't require words or awkward gestures. Ted nodded, approving of her attempt. That's right. Now, let's go one step further. You want to move past the basic stuff? Hold my hand. She blinked. What? Yeah. Take my hand. Don't be shy. Zilphira's eyes flickered from his hand to his face, unsure of what to do. She knew she was strong enough to crush him in an instant, but there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. Was it trust? Or was it something else? She leaned in slowly, extending her hand and carefully, cautiously, placed it into his. Ted's hand disappeared beneath her massive palm, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed gently. See? No big deal. No crush. You're actually really gentle when you want to be. She felt a rush of emotions, pride, relief, and a bit of amusement. For the first time in ages, someone was treating her like an actual human being, not some oversized alien freak. And it felt good. Really good. Okay, Zilphira said, a little breathless. This feels nice. But is it enough? I mean, we've done the handshake, the near touch, and the hand-holding. What's next? Ted raised an eyebrow. Next? Well, next we get to the fun part. The kiss. Zilphira froze, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Wait, what? A kiss? Are you serious? Ted just smirked. Yep, totally serious. But here's the thing. For someone your size, the logistics are tricky. You can't just bend down and kiss me, because that's dangerous for me and you. So we have to work out a way to do it without knocking me out. Zilphira gaped at him, her heart racing. But I'm not sure I can. No worries, Ted interrupted. I'll help you. I've got a lot of tricks up my sleeve. He stepped closer, his hands resting gently on her waist. The trick is in the angle. If we both lean in at the same time, we can avoid a catastrophe. Uh-huh, Zilphira said, her voice shaky. And what if I crush you? You won't. Ted assured her. Just trust me. She hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, she leaned down toward him, angling her body carefully to avoid colliding with anything that might break. Ted did the same, and their faces came closer until their lips were a mere inch apart. She could feel the anticipation hanging in the air between them. There was an intimacy in that moment, an understanding that didn't need words. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but as she finally closed the gap and their lips met, something incredible happened. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But it was real. And it felt right. When they pulled away, both were breathless, smiles creeping across their faces. See? Ted said, his voice a little raspy. Told you we could figure it out. Zilphara couldn't help but laugh, the sound a little shaky but genuine. That was different. But actually nice. Ted grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief. You're a fast learner. We've got a long way to go, though. Are you ready for more? Zilphara looked down at him, a small smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. You bet I am, Ted. And with that, they both moved on to the next chapter in this unexpected, quirky romance, one step at a time. Zilphara and Ted's awkward, sweet romance continued to develop in a whirlwind of blunders and breakthroughs. After their first kiss, Ted had promised her there was more to human relationships than just holding hands or awkwardly bumping lips. He was determined to teach her everything she needed to know. So now we're going to talk about dating, Ted said one evening, his tone a little too serious for the subject at hand. Zilphara raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. Dating? But we've already kissed. Isn't that the ultimate step for humans? Ted snorted, shaking his head. Nah, the kiss is just a tiny part. Dating is about learning each other, your likes, your dislikes, your habits, your quirks. And it's a whole lot more complicated than just pecking someone on the lips. Zilphara looked down at him, her massive form towering over his small frame. And how do we date without, well, destroying everything around us? Ted shrugged, unbothered by her size. It's all about balance. You're big, but you've got the control. Plus, you don't need a fancy restaurant or candles. Let's start simple. Zilphara let out a laugh, which felt oddly refreshing. Simple? In my world, simple is a battlefield. But I'll give it a try. So let's go for a walk in the park, Ted suggested, grinning. Nothing fancy, just us. You know, a normal human date. Zilphara hesitated. A walk in the park. Don't I need to bring you flowers or something? Ted waved it off. Nah, we don't need flowers. This isn't a rom-com. Just go for a walk, chat, laugh, whatever. Think of it like a practice run. Zilphara's mind was swirling. Humans seemed so complicated sometimes. Yet here he was, suggesting a date that sounded more like an afternoon stroll than an intimate affair. She had seen humans in parks before, couples sitting on benches, holding hands, laughing. It seemed so easy. She towered over Ted as they stepped outside, trying to be cautious of the earth beneath her feet. Every step felt monumental, but Ted was always a few steps ahead, moving with a casual confidence. He never made her feel like she was an inconvenience, even when her massive feet crushed small twigs and the ground quaked beneath her weight. So, what do we talk about? Zilphara asked, glancing down at Ted as they walked along the path. Ted shrugged, hands casually in his pockets. Anything. Movies, books, your culture, anything. But mostly, just talking. Getting comfortable with each other. Zilphara glanced at the nearby couples walking hand in hand. Humans seem so comfortable with this whole dating thing. How do they do it without, well, stepping on each other? It's a balance, like I said, Ted replied, finding a rhythm. And yeah, there are some awkward parts. But the point is, you're supposed to have fun. So let's try this. Tell me something that you find totally ridiculous about Earth. Zilphira's eyes sparkled with mischief. You really want to know? Absolutely, Ted replied, a grin spreading across his face. Hit me with it. Zilphira took a deep breath. Okay, here goes. You humans, you walk around in small boxes made of wheels, pretending they're somehow safer than walking. And then you fill them with food, giant bags of it, when there are perfectly fine plants and animals around. Ted stared at her, eyes wide. Wait, you're telling me that you've never seen a car before? No, she replied, her voice firm. What is the point of riding in a box when you have legs? What's next? A whole park full of food packages? Ted burst into laughter. Okay, fair point. But hey, we have our reasons. Sometimes walking isn't enough, especially when there's a lot of distance to cover. Zilphira tilted her head, considering this. I suppose. But it does sound ridiculous. What's next? People eating things that come in cans? Ted laughed harder. Oh yeah, it gets worse. We have entire markets dedicated to cans, bags, and weird liquid food. But hey, it works for us. She shook her head in disbelief. Humans, I swear, your world is a series of strange ideas put together. Ted chuckled, glancing at her with fondness. You're starting to get it. And what about your people? What's the most ridiculous thing about your culture? Zilphira's face softened as she thought for a moment. Well, in my world, we're taught that physical appearance means everything, especially for women. We're encouraged to hide any imperfections. The concept of loving yourself as you are, that's rare. Ted frowned, his expression shifting to one of empathy. That's messed up. I mean, you're beautiful. No one should feel like they have to hide their imperfections. Zilphira looked down at him, her voice soft. Thank you. You're the first person to ever say that to me. Ted smiled up at her, the warmth in his eyes making her feel something she wasn't used to. It's true. Your size, your strength, it's all part of what makes you special. And you don't need to hide it. Her heart fluttered. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she knew there was something about Ted's words that made her feel seen. Not just as a giant, not just as an alien, but as a person. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they continued their walk. Ted told her stories about his childhood, his weird family, and his odd obsession with sci-fi movies. Zilphira shared stories of her home planet, of the strange rituals her people practiced, and the humor that came with trying to fit into a world that didn't quite understand them. As the day wore on, Zilphira began to relax, realizing that Ted wasn't just teaching her about human relationships, he was showing her that her size didn't have to define her. The walk wasn't perfect. She almost tripped over a bench, and a few people gave her curious glances. But with Ted by her side, everything felt a little bit easier. Eventually, they sat on a bench, taking a break from their walk. Ted leaned back, stretching his legs. Zilphira folded her arms across her chest, her gaze softening as she looked at him. You know, Zilphira said, I never thought a simple walk would teach me so much. Ted grinned. Yeah, that's what it's all about. It's not about grand gestures or expensive dinners. It's about being with someone, sharing the little things. Zilphira smiled, her heart swelling. I think I'm starting to understand this dating thing. Ted nodded, looking proud of her. You're doing great. And hey, you're way more fun than most people I've met. You're not just some giant alien, you're Zilphira, and that's more than enough. Zilphira sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on his words. She had spent so long believing that her size made her unlovable, that her differences made her an outsider. But now, sitting on this park bench with Ted, she realized something important. She didn't need to change to fit in. She just needed to be herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ted had always thought of himself as a regular guy. He wasn't anything special, at least that's what he told himself. But every time he looked up at Zilthara, her towering frame, her radiant beauty, and her sharp, quirky sense of humor, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had something extraordinary right in front of him. The moment was approaching, though he didn't want to admit it. Zilthara had become more than a project for him, more than a crash course in human romance. She was someone he actually enjoyed spending time with, someone whose perspective on life made him see the world differently. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, or the way her laugh echoed in the quiet nights they spent together, but the way she looked at him. Zilthara had stopped seeing herself as a monstrous, towering creature and had started to see herself through Ted's eyes. Someone beautiful, someone worthy of love. But now, they were getting to the part of the relationship where things could get complicated. They had shared laughs, awkward moments, and even a few heartfelt confessions. But Ted had an unsettling feeling that they hadn't really had the deep conversation yet, the one that could either strengthen their connection or shatter it. One evening, after another spontaneous dinner in the small apartment Ted rented, the silence between them grew heavy. Zilthara was on the couch, her large form almost engulfing it, while Ted sat in his chair, fiddling with his phone. Neither of them had spoken for a while, the weight of unsaid words hanging between them. "You know," Zilthara started, breaking the silence, "I never realized how much I was missing. The small things. Holding hands, kissing, laughing together." Ted looked up from his phone, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, there's something to be said about the little things, huh?" She nodded, her face softening. "It's strange. I thought that being different would keep me from finding someone like you. But I'm not sure anymore." Ted swallowed hard, the realization hitting him. This wasn't just about teaching Zilthara about human love. It was about figuring out how to be together, how to make it work despite all their differences. He leaned forward, setting his phone aside. "Zilthara, you've become more than just someone I'm teaching. You've become someone I really care about." Zilthara blinked, as if processing his words, before her lips curled into a tentative smile. "You really mean that?" "Yeah," Ted said softly. "I do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zilthara shifted on the couch, and Ted watched her, his mind racing. There were still so many things they hadn't addressed. Sure, they had awkwardly kissed, shared laughs, and even talked about food and cars, but there was still the unspoken tension in the air, about their relationship, about what it could mean in the long run. He took a deep breath and stood up, pacing a little. "Listen, I don't want to make things weird, but I've been thinking. We've been doing all these fun things together, but—" Zilthara raised an eyebrow. "But?" Ted hesitated, not sure how to say it. "But I don't know what happens next. We're from completely different worlds. You're not just from another planet, you're huge. I'm not some brave warrior who can protect you if something happens. What if things get serious?" Zilthara's expression softened, and she stood up, her towering height suddenly making Ted feel small. But she wasn't intimidating now. She wasn't a giant to be feared. She was Zilthara, the woman who had grown in his heart. "Listen, Ted," she said gently, "I know I'm different. I know I'm massive. But I'm learning that being different doesn't mean I'm unlovable. And it doesn't mean that I can't love you back." Ted looked up at her, her words settling in his chest like a warm embrace. It was true. Despite their differences, despite the size disparity, despite everything that could have made their relationship complicated, there was something undeniably real between them. "Do you think it'll be easy?" Ted asked, his voice quiet. "No," Zilthara replied, her tone surprisingly light. "But I think it'll be worth it. And isn't that what relationships are about? They're not easy, but they're worth it." Ted swallowed, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It was exactly what he needed to hear. maybe things wouldn't be easy. They'd have to navigate a world that wasn't built for someone like her. Someone who could accidentally crush a car underfoot. But maybe that wasn't the point. They could figure it out, one step at a time. "I've never met anyone like you," Ted said softly, his heart pounding in his chest. You're incredible, Zilthara." Her smile grew, her expression warm and affectionate. "And you're not so bad yourself, Ted." They stood there for a moment, the air around them thick with unspoken understanding. Ted felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, affection, and something deeper. There was still a lot to figure out, but for once, he wasn't worried. He didn't feel the need to have everything planned out. For the first time in a long while, he was just present. "I don't know what the future holds," Ted said quietly, "but I know I want to find out with you." Zilthara's eyes softened, and she reached down to gently lift him by the waist, pulling him close. Ted didn't resist. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her massive neck, feeling her warmth, her strength, and the undeniable affection that radiated from her. "I think we can do this," she whispered. "One step at a time." Ted's chest tightened with emotion. "Yeah, I think we can too." And so, despite all the odds, despite the size differences and the awkward moments, Ted and Zilthara began to navigate a relationship that was uniquely theirs. It wasn't about the size of the person or the world they came from. It was about how they fit together, how they made each other laugh, how they made each other feel seen. In the end, that was all that mattered. Love, they realized, was about connection, and no matter how improbable or strange, it was something worth fighting for. Ted looked up at Zilthara, a grin spreading across his face. "By the way, I think we need to work on your kissing technique. You almost crushed me." Zilthara's eyes twinkled, and a mischievous smile appeared on her lips. "You're lucky I like you, human." Ted chuckled, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm the lucky one." And with that, they both knew that no matter how strange or difficult things might get, they had each other. And that, in itself, was enough.